All right, Rising Church. Well, welcome to week 5 of our Grows. We're kind of at the midpoint of our session here as we continue diving into the book of Ecclesiastes and living life in reverse in that sense. And so today we're going to be kind of following up a little bit on what we talked about last week and also segueing into what we're going to be talking about next week here in the middle. And if you were here last week, we talked about this idea of envy and kind of greed and sin in general and how there's nobody who is righteous, and that's why we need Jesus. And so I kind of want to start off by kind of starting off at that same point because we talked about, where does kind of all this evil in the world come from? And a lot of it comes to do with our desires and our kind of what we want and what we see in other people that we desire. And so envy, and this is what Solomon says in Ecclesiastes 4:4. He says, "And I saw that all toil and all achievement spring from one person's envy of another, and this too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind." He's saying all this work, all this toil, all this achievement that we're going after really is because we see what other people have and we want what they have, and therefore that's why we work to get it. And then if you kind of skip ahead to Ecclesiastes 6 verse 7, he says, "Everyone's toil is for their mouth, yet their appetite is never satisfied." He's like, everyone's trying to get these things that they think is going to satisfy their taste or their thirst or for their mouth. And it kind of reminds me of what Paul talks about in Philippians chapter 4. He talks about how their God is their stomach. And it's the idea that we kind of need to satisfy these hungers and these thirsts and desires. And so we go after these things thinking they're going to satisfy it. But our appetite, just like our physical appetite, it's never satisfied. And so what we're going to talk about today, and then next week, we're going to talk more about contentment with what we have. But this week, I want to talk a little bit about kind of what Solomon has to say about wealth and about kind of our possessions and kind of what we do with these things. What do we do with wealth and possessions and money and riches and our stuff? It's like, what's our approach towards these things? Are we seeking these things, trying to fill ourselves up? Because Solomon went that route. If you remember, he's like, I did everything. It's like, I tried everything. Anything that I thought would bring me pleasure, I bought, I had. And he's like, it's all meaningless and it didn't really do anything. It didn't find my meaning and my purpose in there. But what happens when we do, because that's what I feel like you see a lot of the world doing, is trying to fill themselves with wealth and stuff, and will it satisfy, and what happens. So we're going to be reading some passages in your Grove in chapter 5 of Ecclesiastes, because he's going to kind of tackle some of these issues. He's going to say, hey, what's the deal with this? Like, what happens when you have a misplaced value on money or wealth? And is it going to satisfy, or is it actually going to have some harmful consequences? You see, kind of one of the things I feel like he's saying to us is, hey, there's more than one way to be rich, and there's also more than one way to be poor. Because just because you're rich doesn't mean you're rich. Does that make any sense? And just because you're poor physically doesn't mean you're poor. And I always think of the example of, for years, we've been going to Tijuana with students, and we've been leading them on these mission trips. And so these students are coming out of affluence, coming out of Gwinnett County. They go to Tijuana, Mexico, and they see these families who are living in kind of homes constructed out of whatever they can find. So, from our perspective, very, very poor. And they most of these people will move to Tijuana because they're trying to give their families a better start. And so there's a lot of factories along the border. And so they'll come to try to get a job in a factory where they might make $50 a week or $40 a week. Most of that money goes to pay for their kids' education and to pay for them to go to school and for their clothing and health stuff. And so they don't really have a lot of money to invest in their house because they don't have a lot of disposable income. And so our students go down there and they see these families living in a one-bedroom kind of shanty, all in one room together, the living room and the kitchen and everything. It's just one room, really. And they'll be kind of confused because they'll say, these people are so poor, and yet they'll see these people that have joy or contentment or satisfaction, and they're not bitter and angry. They just seem to be enjoying themselves and enjoying their life. And our students will scratch their heads, and even the adults who go, and being like, well, wait a minute, because we've been taught that that's not supposed to be true. Like, if you are poor physically, that means you're just kind of poor in all aspects, but that's not necessarily true. And I've seen the opposite of that. I think I mentioned my first job and doing the whole lifeguard thing, and you guys remember that story about when I showed up, and I'm not a lifeguard, I'm a pool attendant, and they said, go ahead and lifeguard, and I was in this area community called Turtle Rock in Irvine, which is really wealthy and really kind of well off. And when I started Young Life, I was actually at University High School, which was where all those rich people, not just the rich people, but a lot of the rich students would go. And I remember this one girl who was in our Young Life Club, and they were like so wealthy. Like, she was telling me one after Christmas vacation, I'll never forget this. She's like, oh yeah, we just went to Australia, New Zealand for Christmas break and spent 2 weeks there. And I'm like, oh man, how awesome is that? Like, you guys are so rich. Like, I didn't say that to her, but you guys are so rich, you're so wealthy, you get to do all these great things. And she's like, no, it was horrible, because we never spend any time together. Nobody gets along. Everybody hates each other. My parents are probably going to get divorced. And it's like they were rich, and yet they were poor. And then you have poor people who are actually rich. And so it's kind of this question that Solomon's going to be asking. Is like, hey, what are you going to do with your wealth? Because just because you have a lot of wealth doesn't mean that you have wealth. And just because you don't have wealth doesn't mean you're poor. And so he's going to kind of question that, and I want you to kind of think about it, because he's going to talk about wealth and riches. He's going to talk about kind of giving and what we do with this, and kind of how we overcome this greed and this need for more and more and more and more. And so I kind of want you just to think about it and really kind of ask yourself, hey, am I rich in the way that I want to be rich? And if I am rich, what do I do with the resources that God has blessed me with? One of the things he's even going to say is like, hey, people that, if you have wealth and possessions and you have the ability to enjoy them, he's like, that's a gift from God. Because people have wealth and riches, but they may not have the ability to enjoy them. Those are two different things. And so we're going to be talking about that some. But I want to leave you with a quote from John Wesley, kind of when it comes to wealth and money and possessions and giving and all these different things we're going to be unpacking today. He says, hey, make all you can, save all you can, give all you can. And I just thought that was a great approach, because it's this idea of what's the value that you place on money and what do you do with it, and can you have healthy wealth in a way that honors God? And that's kind of what I think Solomon's trying to figure out, because he was wealthy, and it's not a sin to be wealthy. It's a question of the value that you place on your wealth and what you do with it. So make all you can, save all you can, give all you can. I think that's kind of a good little phrase to get us started with what we're going to talk about today. So hope you guys have a great discussion. Hope it's not too uncomfortable, because when we start talking about money, people get a little bit uncomfortable, but hopefully you can be honest and share some thoughts and dive into Ecclesiastes. And we will check you back out next week.